Good evening and welcome to the 2023 Virtual Speaker Series of the Alameda Museum. My name is Rashid Shabazz. I'm Vice President of the Alameda Museum and also Chair of the Exhibitions and Events Committee. Really grateful that you've all joined us for the first of our 2023 series. We'll have 4 events, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on, but really grateful for the presence of Dorothy Lazard for our first speaker, historian, author, and I don't know, former librarian or once a librarian, always a librarian.
That is true. That is true.
So before Dorothy joins us, I'd like to welcome up the president of the Alameda Museum, Valerie Turpin. Please join us, Valerie.
All right, here we are. Just want to welcome everybody to our first virtual speaker event of the season. And thank you to Rashid for lining up some really great speakers this year. So, tell your friends about it, and you can go to the alamedamuseum.org website to check on more information on upcoming events. We're working on getting those online this week, but so if you'd like to come visit our museum, we're currently open on weekends, Saturdays 11 to 4 and Sundays 1:30 to 4. And we have the Myers House, which will be open on this upcoming Saturday, which is a historic home that you can tour the grounds and the estate there. So come see our museum if you haven't already, and welcome tonight.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I unmuted fast enough just so no one said, I think you're muted. After all these years of Zoom.
It's a learning process.
Absolutely. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to introduce, I want to say, one of my favorite librarians, if not my favorite librarian, Dorothy Lazard, who I had the honor and pleasure of meeting a little over a decade ago while I was writing my undergraduate thesis focused on Alameda. And she was, to say useful is an understatement. And so really grateful for the opportunity to introduce her this evening, and really grateful that she joined us. So our program tonight is titled Placing Yourself in History, The Challenges of Writing Memoir. Dorothy Lazard, former head librarian of the Oakland History Center, formerly the Oakland History Room, has written a well-received coming-of-age memoir, What You Don't Know Will Make a Whole New World, about growing up in the Bay Area in the 1960s and 1970s. And in this presentation this evening, she'll share some of the challenges of writing a memoir, tips on how to frame family stories, and advice on how to place oneself in a larger cultural narrative. Dorothy Lazard is a writer, archivist, and librarian. From 2009 to her retirement from the Oakland Public Library in 2021, she managed the Oakland History Center, where she helped students, scholars, filmmakers, city planners, novelists, and many others tell Oakland stories. For her work at the Oakland History Center, she's been honored with the Oakland Heritage Alliance's Partners in Preservation Lifetime Achievement Award in 2022, and the Book Club of California's Oscar Lewis Award for Outstanding Contributions to Western History, and that was this year. Dorothy, who holds a Master's in Fine Arts and Creative Writing from Goucher College, has published writing in the Public Library, a photographic essay, Oakland Noir, and the Oakland Heritage Alliance News, amongst other publications. Please welcome Dorothy Lazard.
Thank you, Rashid. I'm really happy to be here with you in conversation, and hopefully it'll turn into a conversation with all of our participants and visitors to this event. I want to talk to you tonight about writing memoir and how you pull a story together. All of us have so many different stories to tell, and all of us have stories of our own to share with other people. And we have to figure out how to tell those stories. And that's what I'm going to be focused on tonight as I talk to you. So I hope you get a lot out of this. I got a lot out of the adventure of writing my story. But I want to first begin by talking about why I felt it was necessary to write my memoir. It was something I was driven to do maybe 2017, 2018. I wanted to commemorate in some way my coming to California because I was at the age, and I am at the age, where I'm looking backward a lot. I'm looking at my life, my influences, people who've influenced me, and I'm trying to sort out, well, how did I become who I became? How did I develop the a political stance that I have, the attitudes that I have, the types of food I like? I had become a Californian. I had come from St. Louis, Missouri. That was my native place, and I was toying around, not toying around with, but just really pondering, well, how did I get to be the person that I am today? And so in 2017, those questions were going round and round in my head. I also was asked by a friend, or dared by a friend, to maybe write some of my memories down. She said, "You've had an interesting life. Have you ever thought about writing about it?" And I hadn't. Of course, I have thought a lot about my life, but I hadn't thought about putting it on paper, as it were, and writing it down and turning it into a book until that year, 2017, 2018. And so I have to say, a lot of people are impressed that the book came out so shortly after my retirement. I did not start writing this entire book uh, after my retirement in December 2021. I was always writing something about my life. I've been a habitual journal keeper, a diarist, since I was about 14 years old. I keep diaries and journals about everything, about gardening, about travel. I have a huge box in my basement of travel journals of countries and cities I've been to. Just about everything, movies I like, the journals about everything. And also, instead of buying a red sports car when I turned 40, I decided to go back to school for my Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction. I went to Goucher College, as Rashid said. And so um, in that program, some of what you see in my book started out as homework for that program. So that is the skeleton of the book that I started writing in earnest in 2018. Now, I don't even know if I could say in earnest because, I'd write a little bit and come back to it, and I'd write a little bit, and months would go by, and I'd come back to it. But it was around the time of I would say 2019, well, certainly 2020, I had the time at home to do it. But that's when I really started to think of it as a book and not just disparate essays that I could cobble together sometime in the unforeseen future. So that's the origin story of this book. And I'll read a little bit to you. What I'd like to do as I really get into the nuts and bolts of memoir writing is read a little, talk a little bit about the mechanics of it and the challenges of it, and then maybe read a little bit more. But I'll start with the very beginning of the book, which is about our journey here. My family was following a very long tradition of Black migration west, and we were just one of the thousands of families who came west and for really different reasons, or maybe the same reasons. The Road West, 1968. My family arrived in California the winter after the Summer of Love. Ours was not the journey of eager anticipation of the 19th century gold miners who rushed to the Sierras, or of the anxious desperation of the Dust Bowl refugees who came before us. We were reluctant migrants, but all children are. And the three of us in the back seat of that white Pontiac were indeed children. My mother, my big brother Albert, and me. My grandmother, Ella Baskin, had come to claim us. We were the part of her family who had been living precariously, but sometimes contentedly in St. Louis, away from her and the rest of my mother's clan. This was our first cross-country trip. Our first cross-country trip marked the end of our independence as a nuclear family. The journey along Route 66 was the end and the beginning of everything we had known and would know. As we traveled long and desolate stretches of highway with my mother's younger brother Shelby driving, I tried to imagine what California would be like. The nuns at St. Vincent's had told me about the Golden Gate Bridge, which, with my 8.5-year-old imagination, I thought would be truly golden. We were headed to San Francisco, to my grandmother's house, where we would live. For how long, the nuns at St. Vincent's didn't say. Uncle Shelby, or Shirley, as my grandmother called him, was jovial and gregarious. He told us all about the cousins we didn't know we had, and aunts and another uncle we would soon meet. He was an enthusiastic hugger, which I wasn't used to, but liked just the same. He was solicitous to my mother, and like her, smoked cigarettes like they were going out of style. So I figured they must be related. In that car, I began to see my mother with fresh eyes. Medea was not just my mother, our mother, my father's wife. She was part of something larger, more complex than our nuclear family. Her name was Laverne, but this uncle called her Sis, which gave me the first hints of her having a role other than mother and wife. She had a family that she had been born into, a mother from whose body she sprang, a father who had already lived and died by the time our journey began. Still, I never felt in those first few days with our grandmother that Medea and her mother were close. They didn't talk much during our journey. I couldn't imagine them taking long walks together or playing marbles or Chinese checkers or scrubbing each other's backs during bath time like Medea and I did. No harsh words were exchanged between them, but I sensed they were strangers, not on the same team. There was an unspoken tension. I couldn't remember my mother ever having talked to us about her mother. When our grandmother appeared at St. Vincent's Day home to retrieve us, she could have been the president of Jamaica for all I knew. I had never heard a story about her or seen a picture of her. It wasn't until my brother pushed me toward the Pontiac and I saw our mother in the back seat that I began to think my grandmother could be telling the nuns the truth. And besides, they wouldn't release us to just anybody, would they? After a few days of visiting with our father, who had moved in with our oldest half-sister Mary, we left St. Louis and traveled west along Route 66 and hummed the classic Nat King Cole tune to bide the time. We survived both the curses of racists in Amarillo who chased us off the sidewalks and the hellish heat of the Southwest desert. That journey west was the longest time I had ever spent in a car. We didn't break our cross-country trek with a sleepover anywhere, just kept driving and riding after water breaks and pee breaks and food where we could get it. We made our first stop in Needles, California, just over the state line. Needles, I thought, what a funny name for a place. Were there needles on the ground? Is this where needles were made? Did a lot of seamstresses live there? I didn't know what to expect from the Golden State. It was beautiful in completely alien ways. It was early March and there was no snow on the ground. It wasn't even cold. The landscape was flat as a pancake and vast, dotted with desert scrub. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, we'd see mountains in the distance, so big and majestic, they looked like something out of a cowboy movie. decidedly not urban, which was the only environment I knew. The red brick buildings of St. Louis were nowhere to be found. It was during this trip that I first considered the sky as a separate and beautiful thing, distinct from the earth, not just the incidental wallpaper to some cityscape. Out west, you could see so much of everything all at once. I sensed California could be something quite literally marvelous. It was wide open spaces, orchards, ranches, and rolling hills covered in wildflowers like I'd never seen. I'll stop there. And so, what is memoir? I describe memoir as an abbreviated telling of one's life. A memoir is very episodic. It's never trying to tell the whole story or someone's whole life. It is something focused on a particular time or an event or a particular time in your life where you had a job, or it might be focused on a particular relationship with someone, or a place that you've visited and loved or revisited repeatedly and loved or didn't love. It doesn't aim to tell everything. And the popularity of this genre continues to grow. It has had periods of great interest and great engagement with writers, where writers are, and we've had these explosions over time, most recently in the 90s, and certainly continuing to today. When I was in my MFA program, most people, there were 19 of us, and many of them, not most, but many of them were, we were all writing nonfiction, but many of them chose to write memoir. And I learned from them, from witnessing them, from talking to them, from reading their works, that it is a really complicated and challenging genre to write in. So it could be, memoirs have a kind of an interesting reputation, because sometimes we think of memoir, we think of celebrity memoirs, the Kardashians or whoever is famous writing about themselves, and or another very popular genre, subgenre, is the tortured childhood memoir, which can be very beautiful if handled with someone, by someone with talent. I've read some very painfully brutal, harrowing memoirs. They're so beautifully done and so carefully and compassionately done that the trauma that is depicted in those memoirs is not off-putting at all, but very gives you an opportunity as a reader to be very engaged in a person's ability to write with compassion, to have perspective on their lives. So some questions to ask. I think I'm going to start sharing my screen as we're getting more into the content. If I share my screen, what's going to happen? That's going to happen. So let's not do that. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, your screen's visible.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you, Alex. So what is memoir? I just talked about that. And, I want to point out here something on this slide. It can cover a wide variety of topics. And memoirs typically are not just one thing. They're not just about your childhood or your failed marriage or your job. It's about many things, as our lives are very multidimensional and are influenced by so much. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Here are the considerations. what's your motivation for writing your memoir? You've sat down, Rashid, and you said, I'm going to write about my time in college or something. But what's your motivation? Why are you doing it? And that question may not, the answer to that question may not become apparent right away. Um, I would suggest just start writing. Something's motivated you to even consider doing it. So just honor that impulse and start writing. And at some point, you're going to try to figure out, who is my audience? Who am I writing to? And we'll talk about this later, but you want to sort that out because you want to know how to write to that audience. If you're writing to teens, if you're writing to professionals in your other professionals in your profession, or are you writing to academics or general reader? What will the reader learn about me or my time or my profession or my culture? And that goes back to what I was just saying of how multidimensional our lives are. And everything, all of that, your time, your profession, your culture, your language, all of that can be woven into the story of your life. Am I comfortable sharing personal details about myself, my family, friends, or colleagues? I just got off the phone with a dear friend of mine who I've known since I was 19 years old. We went to college together. And she was, complimenting me about the book, but she kept saying how brave I was in sharing the details of my life and how and why did I do that. So we had this whole conversation right before this event tonight, before I met with you guys. And it does take a lot. It does take a certain amount of courage to make yourself public, and to write unsparingly. And hopefully, if you're opting to write, you do write unsparingly. It doesn't have to be, like Amy Tan has said about memoir, you don't have to have trauma to write a memoir, but you do have to have perspective on what happened to you and perspective on the people who impacted your life or who were in your life. Another consideration to take on is, what is the arc of the story? On what journey am I taking the readers? My book kind of starts in the car and ends in the car. When I got to that point of my story, which I had always intended to be just about my first decade in California, because those are the years that really made me who I am today, politically, socially, as far as diet, everything, all of it, really got programmed during those 10 years. So what's the arc of your story? What story am I going to tell? But and you might not know this right away. Just keep writing. Just keep writing. And how do you do that? You have to decide who's going to tell your story. And the narrator's voice, as the slide says, best represents the mood of the memoir and the personality of the writer. What voice will you claim to tell this story? You have to decide not only who will tell the story, will it be you as an adult or you as a child or some mix, or, you can't have that omniscient narrator when you're writing a memoir, because you are both the narrator and you're the main character. But you still have to make a decision. What persona will I claim or put on in order to tell the story I want to tell? And another side question is, who could best tell this story? For me, I wanted to write the story from as much as I could from a child's perspective, because I wanted to empower that kid you see on the cover, that 9-year-old you see on the cover. I wanted to empower her, and I wanted to give her some agency. You know, in my childhood, I had no agency. So it was, in this book, I wanted it to be about agency. So I decided, and there are pros and cons of doing this, I decided to tell it from a kid's perspective as much as I could. Of course, you got to put some adult perspective in there just to, you know, maintain the frame. Um, so the types of voices you can claim: funny, melancholy, bitter, angry. I mean, there are so many different emotions, right? So you can decide. I mean, there are enormously funny memoirs. I'm thinking Bill Bryson, Rick Barry. And then there are some that are, you know, very, you know, strident, and some are just kind of melancholy. I read A Chance in the World by Steve Pemberton, harrowing story about him growing up in foster care. But there was certain buoyancy in his telling, in the voice that he used, a hopefulness that he was able to demonstrate. The other thing about voice, you have to be a reliable narrator. You have to tell the truth. I don't know if you remember James Fry. What was the name of that a memoir? A Million Little Pieces? No, that's something else. But he got called out for making up uh, parts of his memoir, and chastised by Oprah on her show. This was, you know, maybe 15 years ago. But be a reliable narrator. Why bother telling your life? A Million Little Pieces, thank you. Why bother telling your story if you're not going to tell the truth? You know, write fiction if you want to make up something. And like I said before, the narrator, when you're writing memoir, you're writing as memoir, you're writing as a narrator and you're the main character. So you have to make yourself a character and depict, you know, all of your emotions and things that happen to you, and just as you would if you were writing fiction. So that's a balancing act that you have to claim. While we're talking about voice, I also want to do like a little side thing and talk a little bit about theme. And theme is something, I mentioned something about a child's agency. This is a story about my agency, but it's also a story about my mother's agency and how she had lost so much of her independence and agency uh, as she came out here to live among her younger siblings and her mother. And so she had to, so when you're, what I really wanted to focus on, what were scenes that would depict um, dependence and independence or interdependence, but also agency and ambition, my own in this case. So the memoir needs a spine on which to hang those stories. And that the spine tends to be the theme of your story. And you can have multiple themes, and the themes might not become apparent right away. The theme may show up, you know, halfway through the manuscript where you realize that, oh, wait a minute, this story isn't about this thing that I set out to write, but it's about so much more, or something completely that I didn't set out to be focused on. So yeah, I told you I set out to write about my mother's powerlessness, but it also kind of connected us. So it's about family connection. My particular story is about family connection too. And so these themes can be chosen, they could be discovered along the way. It can help you streamline the larger story you want to tell, to be aware of the theme. And you basically can use it as a guidepost, or I use the word spine of your story, that you're choosing what stories to tell uh, based on the themes that you want to illuminate. Okay. Come on, slideshow, you can do this. So how do you insert yourself in history? So this is the part of my presentation that I really want to focus on because, you know, I'm a librarian. Um, and so, like I said, we have multidimensional lives. We're influenced by so much in our lives. So what we want to do is use all those influences, whether it be the things we learned in history class or in our families or by music or news or any of that. You want to make sure that you have created the character, you, who is living in the moments that you lived in. And so that the reader sees where you are. You know, Mary Carr, who I'll talk about in a bit, talks about inserting, having in your memoir a certain carnality where a reader knows where you are. They have a sense of how urgent things were, if it's a situation that calls for that, or how scary things were to you as a kid, or whatever you're depicting. Make sure the reader feels that with you and for you. And so here are the tools that you can use to place yourself in history. Certainly, you can use your memory. For me, I was very much influenced when I decided to write a memoir to celebrate my 50 years in California and to celebrate the way I became a Californian. Um, I was very influenced by Tobias Wolff, and he wrote This Boy's Life, which is now considered a classic in the genre of memoir. In it, at the very beginning, he tells us that he didn't interview anybody to verify what he wanted to write or what he had written. He said this was a story my memory had to tell. And I'd always been intrigued, you know, now 25 years later, I am still intrigued by that. One of the motivations for writing this memoir was certainly not only to celebrate the 50 years in California, but to also reclaim some of the memories that I have because I was losing so much of my memory. I feel like I had lost a lot of important stuff that must have happened, but I don't remember this person's name or where were we when this happened, that kind of thing. And so memory is a really good place to start. Just write it all down before you forget it. Write it down and give it to your kids or share it with your siblings. It's a great tool. When I set out to write this, I had no publisher. I had no idea where I'd send it to. Once I finished it, I had no idea when I'd finish it. I just wanted to preserve that memory. I didn't know if I was just going to leave it for my relatives, you know, and they find it in my effects, as they say. Interviewing family and friends is totally okay. Coworkers, public figures, whoever has been in your life, or whoever will be featured in your memoir, who mattered in the story that you want to tell in your memoir. It's totally okay to interview them. Diaries and journals, I've talked about that a little bit. Um, Always good to go back, but it's also funny because you know, when you're keeping a journal or a diary, that document is influenced by whatever mood you were in or whatever state of development you were in. And so, you know, it could sound a little crazy. You know, you look back at a journal from years ago or when you were a teen and you could be horrified. Trust me, I know. Um, Personal letters and other correspondences are great. Even correspondences that weren't sent to you, but may illuminate something, say about your family or an event in your family. So those are great things. Of course, newspapers and magazines are great memory triggers, and not only historic documents, but great memory triggers. school yearbooks, movies, TV, photographs. I mean, when I was working in the Oakland History Center, the use of photographs were so important to so many people, so many researchers, so much so that I thought it was always interesting that people would say they were looking for a document, but what they really meant was they wanted to see a photograph. It was kind of like they were acknowledging, by asking the question in that way, they were kind of acknowledging how important and how informative photographs can be. And they are. That was actually one of my favorite things to do when we'd get a cache of photographs donated to the History Center, to figure out, well, when did this happen? Who are these people? When did that car come out? You know, trying to date and place the images in the photographs. Music is a huge trigger. Smell is a huge trigger. I cannot I cannot smell violets, the candy, or patchouli without thinking about the Haight-Ashbury, my first California neighborhood, which I write about in the book. And Rashid, I want to stop there. It's 7:15. I want to know how much time we have.
You have time. We can continue a little past 7, or
Okay.
beyond 7, and then we'll have opportunity for
I
myself
want to make
to ask
sure we
questions.
have Q&A, and I want to talk about some forms now. I'm going to leave this slide up and you can read it at your leisure. But while the slide is up, I want to talk about forms. You can do a straight chronological coming of age narrative like I did, like Maya Angelou did with her fabulous classic, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Joe Brainerd, I Remember, is a fantastic memoir. It's basically just a list. It's a tiny little book, and he starts every sentence with "I remember." So after a few pages, and he's remembering a lot. You know, he's remembering a lot about his sensations of growing up, relationships. It is very full bodied, but he delivers it in this really interesting way. There's a documentary about Joe Brainerd, the author of I Remember, online now, that you could see. And I just discovered it by happenstance last week. I highly recommend his book if you can get a copy of it. You don't feel shortchanged at all by his narrative choice to write the book in that way at all. There, it could be, your memoir could also be elliptical and impressionistic. Lucille Clifton, the poet Lucille Clifton, wrote a memoir called Generations, which is kind of written from her perspective, but also the perspective of her parents and other relatives. A tiny, tiny book like Joe Brainerd's book, but very impactful. The one memoir I recently read in recent years was Memorial Drive by the poet Natasha Thwethwy. I can't say her last name. I'm sorry. She was a poet laureate of the United States, wrote an amazing memoir that is both a daughter remembering a murdered mother, but also kind of like a crime investigation too. So that's really great. You could also write a memoir about your job. I'm thinking Michael Perry's Population 485. He was a emergency medical technician, you know, ambulance driver, and in a rural part of the country. Fascinating book, fascinating book. On the list here, Ta-Nehisi Coates, of course, everyone knows, Between the World and Me. But before that, he wrote a gorgeous memoir about his relationship with his father called A Beautiful Struggle. Ann Patchett, gorgeous, wrote, a novelist, Ann Patchett, wrote about her friendship with the late poet Lucy Greeley, and how complicated and interdependent and crazy making and loving that relationship was. Truth and Beauty was one of my favorite memoirs. But then there are things that you discover. Mary Carr is on the top of my list, and I want to make sure before we stop tonight to say Mary Carr has written a great book called The Art of Memoir. She's taught memoir for many years. When I was in the late 90s, when I was in my MFA program, Mary Carr was all the rage. Everybody was talking about Mary Carr, Mary Carr. She's written 3 very well received memoirs. She also is a poet. But she's written this very instructive book on writing memoir. And I love the fact that she's not only added a list of great memoirs, but she also has a chapter in it, Why Memoirs Fail. She has millions of, not millions, but dozens and dozens of examples of memoirs and why they work and how they work. And in it, she talks about that carnality that I was just talking about, putting yourself in the character's space, your space, making you feel exactly, I don't even know how to say it, making you just feel where the character, Dorothy, is, or whoever is the memoirist. I'm just going to read a little bit. This is about my reading Harriet the Spy and the aftermath. And hopefully this will illustrate what I mean by carnality, putting the reader in the moment with you, the character, but also the narrator. So I've read Harriet the Spy, and I've started writing in a small steno pad, small notebook about all the things I'm discovering, how people smoke, how they ate, what they tugged around in their bags as they're walking from the store. And I say, it was fun to watch life and all of its varied details go on around me. I felt my senses developing, like muscles being toned. One day, while I was playing with Peppy in the backyard, enjoying a swatch of rare afternoon sun, my grandmother called me in. By the way, I'm 10 here. Hey, come in here. I saw the top of her head as she leaned over the banister. You hear me? I know you're down there. When I reached her on the sun porch, I saw she was holding my rumpled notebook. What's this? She asked. Her smirk let me know that she was in no mood for half-baked answers or sullen silence. That's my notebook, I said more defensively than I intended. What is this you're writing in here? About me and folks in my church. She flipped through the pages. See, here's my name. Ella puts on her white usher board uniform and white shoes and heads to church every Sunday at the same time. I couldn't figure out why she was so angry. I hadn't misrepresented her. What was so bad about me noticing her? She went on, pointing out names of familiar people and places. Why are you taking this down? Even though I had pretended to be a spy, I figured my grandmother must know, how could she think otherwise, that these were only harmless notes, descriptive phrases that became sentences, seeds to stories I would write for my backyard audience of one. Surely, I thought, she couldn't believe I was a real spy. I was just writing, I said. They're just notes. But for what? Why did you put my name on this paper? I shrugged. That was enough to set her off. She reached for the fly swatter, the nearest weapon she could find, and popped me a few times on my bare legs. Tears came, but not from any pain inflicted by the fly swatter. I cried because once she put the fly swatter away, she peeled off page after page from my notebook and ripped each one into shreds. By destroying my first attempts at writing, though, my grandmother unwittingly lit a fire. Her act of intolerance was an important lesson about the power of words. There was something about what I had written that had put her on the defensive, made her look at me different with a suspicion that, at least, promised engagement, if not acceptance. Words written were exhilarating but costly. People who were committed to them paid a price, I was learning, and that price, I would realize later, is where great stories come from. With these words set down so innocently, I was building a voice of my own, word by word, page by page. All learning is risk, for it is an admission that you don't know something and are willing to do whatever it takes to gain that knowledge, no matter the cost to ego, relationships, or expectations. Words that had lain so passively on pages before my relationship with the library now took on new meaning. Every word meant something, and together they could create storms, tirades, worry, suspicion. They could also liberate and weave fresh possibilities. All children have interior secret lives where their imaginations blossom and their perceptions of their worlds form. I was no different. As a reader, I was learning so much, but I somehow understood that not all of what I was learning should be shared. I'll stop there. Should we open it up for questions?
Sure, I have a question. Let's stop the screen share and
Oh, wait a minute. Here's this final
go
slide,
for
I
it.
think. There are some books on crafts, the art of memoir. I don't know if people could still see me. No, because you're looking at the screen. Inventing the Truth, the art and craft of memoir, edited by William Zinsser. Writing the Memoir from Truth to Art by Judith Barrington. Living to Tell the Tale, a guide to writing memoir by Jane Taylor McDonald. And the Situation and the Story, the Art of Personal Narrative by Vivian Gornick. All of these have been helpful in one way or another to me in not only writing this memoir, but reading memoirs. Okay. Oh, wait a minute, I should look in the chat, shouldn't I?
Yeah,
Okay.
it hasn't started up yet, but we'll invite folks soon to begin to add anything they'd like to share.
Should I
Any
stop
questions they'd
the
like to ask.
share?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you.
I'll come back on screen and join you.
Yay.
So thank you so much for sharing not only from your own memoir, but just part of the journey of writing, and also encouraging other folks to do it as well. I add myself to the spotlight briefly. So I'm curious why you chose this, working at the library and you worked with a lot of historians, why you perhaps chose this genre opposed to some of the others you may have had an opportunity to explore.
Um, well, this was a story that I felt I had to get out. I wanted to pay some kind of homage to my life here, my first few years here in California. And so that's why I chose to start there. I mean, most people think, the people who know me know my career at the library were kind of expecting, when word got out that I was writing a memoir, that it would be about the library.
The life and times of
The
your
life
favorite
and times
librarian.
of the Oakland History Center, or whatever I would have called it. But even that would be very close to a memoir. It would certainly be about the work, and I am writing about the library, by the way. um, but yeah, I think it would not feel necessarily the same because an adult narrator would be telling you the story. who
Yeah.
has a lot more, insight into how the city works, how the library works, different relationships with people, as opposed to the kid who's trying to basically just survive her childhood. So the tone would be different, the narrator would be different because I am different. And so, yeah, that's why.
Awesome. And so this, I'm going to encourage folks to either, you can put a question into the chat, which I can share, and you're certainly able to use that raise hand function.
Mhm.
Also, to if you'd like to ask a question, I wanted to ask just a follow up. You made a comment about folks embellishing their, their stories. I'm trying to use the little GRE word, but folks lying, making stuff up. And so I'm curious, besides your point of like, why would you do that? I think for folks who are interested in histories, um, learning about the past, what caution should we have when looking at memoir, knowing that there is that possibility for someone to either
Well,
misremember.
if someone got caught lying, I would want to know, well, why would you go about lying about your own life? I mean, what is it for marketability purposes? Is it due to shame? I'd be curious to know why one would set out writing about their life, but then lie about it. Um, Yeah, and it could be any combination of those things, true. But I guess I would want to know why. How does it serve our understanding of the person who's writing the book by lying, especially if you get caught lying? And I'm sure people have lied and embellished, if we want to use a kinder word. But To what end? What purpose does it serve? I mean, I could see someone making a genuine error in their telling of the story of their life. Like, I've always believed it's this.
Mhm.
For example, I thought my father's age, use a real example, I thought my father's age was the age on my birth certificate, but it wasn't at all. And so, if I were to say that without acknowledging in the piece that this is something that I thought, and this is where craft comes in.
Mhm.
There are parts in my memoir where I say, "Well, I don't know," and the whole theme of the book and the title is referencing what you don't know. And being a child, and that's what helped me choose to
Mhm.
tell it from a child's perspective, is that there was a lot I didn't know. I didn't know why we were in the orphanage. I just speculated why we're in the orphanage. I didn't know my grandmother. I just speculated that I didn't even speculate. I had no knowledge of my grandmother as my mother's mother. Um, a memoir will allow you to do that and say, "Well, I don't know. I don't remember that nun's name. I don't remember my first grade teacher's name. Um, well, this was confusing to me." If you allow for um, fallibility or faulty memory in your language, it's okay if you find out later that this wasn't really true, or this event didn't really happen that way. But if you say, "I thought this happened," or "it looked like this happened," or "I was told that this other character said this," then the reader, you haven't lost any narrative trust.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
What's
appreciate. I just want to make one comment. I want to go to one of these questions
hmm
in the chat. It made me recall the autobiography of Malcolm X, and
hmm
which was written with Alex Haley.
hmm
And both, there's the epilogue, which there Alex Haley writes, and he talks about Malcolm's reaction, reading it prior to his assassination, and then later on the book by Manning Marable, where he actually critiques these things in the autobiography, such as characters being sort of a composite of multiple
Right.
individuals, etc. So it's really interesting to hear your read of like, well, what was the motivation? And I think Marvel kind of speculates on that, and so
Mm-hmm.
and folks often do that with some other genres of memoir, like the quote unquote slave narratives, in which there's certain writing conventions that people use. Um, and so, anyway, I appreciate the response.
Well, you mentioned slave narratives, and they were our country's first, personal narratives, or these slave narratives, for African Americans at least. And just to use Frederick Douglass's narrative of life of a slave, there were some things that he withheld from us because of when he was publishing that work. Slavery was still on, he was still considered a fugitive. And so there were things that he didn't expound on. He didn't say exactly, if you recall, how he escaped. You can kind of infer, he was kind of like a rented out slave, enslaved person, but you don't. You can kind of speculate that maybe that's how he got out, because he was constantly going to Baltimore from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, um, to work. But he doesn't tell you, and he doesn't tell you because that slave narrative was written in the 1830s, when he was still very much a fugitive uh, from the institution of slavery. And also he didn't want others to be um, caught if they were to, use the same means to escape.
That's a great point. Absolutely. And then considering that in many instances, literacy was still illegal or inaccessible. And so thinking who's the actual audience of who's going to read it.
Yeah. And
And
in my own work too, Rashid,
Mhm.
there was a lot I wanted to say about, my brother Albert, but I that's not my story to tell.
Mm,
So those kinds of questions, considerations have to be weighed too. What is your story to tell?
mm.
Short of you interviewing people, which I had opted not to do because I wanted it to be a work of memory. So I couldn't put Albert's memories in there, because then you've basically violated your authority as the narrator, right? So,
Absolutely. So I want to go to there's a few questions that are in the chat, but I want to give folks, we'll go one by one, if folks would like to unmute and ask their question. Otherwise, I can
sure,
ask
let's do it that
one.
way.
So I see that there are a few comments by Alex here, but it was more so just comments and not necessarily questions. So just want to reiterate those perhaps. So really that point around motivation. And so for folks
Hmm.
thinking about why you're writing something about yourself. And then for we have Vern Andrews. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Go
Yeah,
for it.
okay. Dorothy just kindly answered the second question, which is figuring out exactly what did happen in events. Sometimes you don't have access to that, so I like the fact that you can at least admit it and just move on. I think that the first one that I asked is one I'd like to ask. How did you figure out what aspects of your life would be interesting to others? With tons of data in our own lives, knowing what might be significant to others is crucial. And I say that because I've been writing a novel, and my friend said, "Man, we meet every month or so." He says, "Man, you should write a memoir." And I didn't know what a memoir was, and I talked to Dorothy about that. I mean, the word had never just popped out in front of me. I was an English major in school, so I was thinking of you had to write an autobiography, which you have to be very important or self-important to write an autobiography. So I said, "Oh, well, that's out the question." But people keep telling me about these things. So my question is, I mean, I've been to New Zealand and, Burning Man and all these other things. Yeah, how do you narrow that focus? And again, I like the fact that you said that memoirs don't have to be all inclusive.
No,
Thank you.
they were never intended to be all inclusive.
Good to know
That's
that.
your out.
Right.
Yeah, that's your out. They are just, it's from the French word memory, and it's very episodic. It's very elliptical. It's very impressionistic, and it doesn't have to be. When I hear the word autobiography, yeah, I mean, you're kind of I recently I was in New York, and I saw a exhibit at the New York Historical Society about Robert Caro, who is this great biographer of important men like Robert Moses and LBJ, President Lyndon Johnson. And autobiography or a biography is about research and journalistic skills and interviewing tons of people and trying to you get very granular. Whereas memoir is always, not to say that there aren't really detailed memoirs. I mean, Mary Carr's Lit is so full of really rich detail and wonderful voices and kind of harrowing life choices and fun and fear and all this stuff. You don't feel cheated at all by it. You don't feel cheated at all by it, like, oh, this skimpy thing. You want to, like she always teaches, you are looking for that carnality. You're looking for that richness of experience and impressions. And, in my own book, I try to get that child's voice to tell as full a story as a child would likely be able to tell. So it's very much about how I felt or I saw, or, the fact of, um, I really wanted to focus on learning. That was one of the themes, educating oneself. I mentioned I wanted to be an autodidact like Malcolm X, a self-taught person. And so I had to, that was a spine on which I hung a lot of the scenes where I'm learning something about myself in society or my family or my mother's lack of agency or something. Every scene, I'm trying to show the reader that I'm learning something.
Awesome.
Thank you, Vernon.
Thank you so much. And we know you had a second question, so we can come back to you if you'd like to ask that question later on in the program. So I see that Kevis, you have a question, as well as John.
Kevin.
Kevis. Yeah,
Hi.
if y'all would like to, please.
Kevis.
Yes, I'll go ahead and ask my question because in typing, I didn't really ask it the way I would like to. So I'm interested in, you started talking about, well, the selection you read at the beginning was a very beautiful and descriptive narration about the journey that you were taking from one community to another in California. And you referred to that you also ended it with a journey or a trip. And I'm just wondering what the role specifically in your memoir and what you felt it brought out of your life experience to have those journeys as sort of bookends. From one community to another when I was 9. So it's a really interesting part to me of what you were describing.
Yeah, well, moving, or when you're a kid, you're basically being moved, impacts you in a very deep, impacts a child in a very deep way, because it typically is the first sign of how little agency I know I keep using that word, but it's an important word, how little agency they have over their lives, and decisions are made for you. At least this is how I perceive my childhood. And what it did for me was bewilder me, but it also inspired me. And it made me really want to grow up so I could have control over my own life. It also made me look at my mom in a different way, because here was a woman who, well, I don't know how many of you have read the book already, but here's a woman who was, this is not giving anything away. She was a grandma, epileptic. She couldn't work, which meant she had no money. And it was at a time in our country's life where women didn't really have a whole lot of agency in their marriages. My father was very old. And so for me, journeys meant not just estrangement from something, and a trip to something. I was always eager to take that trip, which doesn't surprise me that I became a traveler in my adult life, and a very dedicated traveler. I always wanted to go to the next thing, but my life experience also made it equally important for me to make sure I could come back to the thing where I found comfort. So I hope I answered your question there.
Thank you so much. Yes, yes.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was very much the lack of agency and just pulling up stakes from one community where all your friends are to something completely new, right? So
Yes, and
it's
what it does to a kid is it forces the kid to learn how to navigate different settings. You know, I was perpetually the new kid, and I went to three schools in fifth grade. And you're perpetually on your toes trying to learn how to navigate social settings. Or are you going to be bullied? Are you going to make friends? Um, and it creates this kind of uh, this nimbleness in a child, but it can also create a lot of anxiety and bewilderment too. And that's something
thank
that
you
you
so
could,
much.
is that
Thank you.
something that you could really mine, isn't it? In a
Yes,
story.
yeah, yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that question.
Excellent question. So we have two more questions. Again, John's question, and we come back to Vernon. You know, I got a whole list. John, would you like to ask your question, or would you like me to ask you? Welcome to join us.
Are you there, John?
Yep, just unmuted.
Hear me now?
Can hear you now.
Hello? Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Sorry, I had to make a little change here. Thanks so much for your comments. This has been really, really terrific. I have not read your memoir, but I will now. So
Yay.
I will. I said in the chat, and my question was not fully formed, but it has to do with that balance between that drive or that yearning, that determination that you have a story that needs to be told, right, as the author, versus what you were talking about at the start about needing to understand the audience. I think a lot of us think our story doesn't matter. Why should anyone be interested? I think someone else said that earlier. So I'm trying to balance those two questions, I guess, or interrogate those two against each other.
Okay.
That drive, want to tell a story versus what is the audience? What do I think the audience is going to get out of it?
Well, I'm saying audience, I'm not using the word audience in the sense of marketability, like trying to guess who's going to buy the book once it's published. I'm thinking of, who do you want to read that book? I wanted kids to read the book. I wanted migrants, people who've migrated here from other places in the country to read the book, or other countries to California to read the book. I wanted little Black kids to read the book who might not like the library, might not like reading, might not think that they have some place in their city where they can go and completely be safe and completely have the top of their heads opened up by something that engages them. It doesn't necessarily have to be a library. It could be a park. It could be, I don't know, anything. But that's what I meant. Who do you want to read the book? Not necessarily who do you want to buy the book in that marketability sense, in that business sense, but who are you telling the story for? Who? Because everybody actually does have, I believe, have an audience. I think there's an audience for everybody. And so, yeah, that's what I meant by that. And those are the people who I wanted to read the book once I myself was convinced that it was a book and not just random disparate essays that I was writing, because that's how they started, at just random disparate essays.
That's
So,
very helpful. Thank you so much.
yeah.
And what might you say in response to someone who's wondering whether or not their story matters?
I
Like,
think
who am I?
everybody's story matters. I think everybody's story matters. And they might not believe that, but and one of the motivations for writing a memoir or a personal essay, it doesn't have to be a whole book, is to write for yourself that you matter, and that was a little bit of the motivation here, is my childhood mattered. I mean, I'm thinking of all the library patrons that I helped over the years. If that little kid hadn't survived, I wouldn't know Rashid. I wouldn't know Vernon. I went to high school with Vernon, by the way. And so I think everybody's story matters, and I don't mean that in a flippant way at all. But writing, can be salvation as well as a product. Your writing can be a product, but it can also be salvation for someone who actually needs that fuel or that vote of confidence. You could write your own vote of confidence. You can be your own savior, your own superhero through writing. And you don't have to fabricate. I don't think, at least.
Absolutely. Before we come back to anyone who would like to ask another question, again, you're welcome to raise your hand and via Zoom for those who are here with us live in Zoom. And then you can also, again, add it in the chat. I have another question I want to ask. We've had this conversation before. I recall at the library, so that was pre-pandemic, before times. Just with folks who you talked about moving and as a reluctant migrant, but people are or displaced. And what often happens is folks have this stuff, and maybe a family member, someone passes away, and then people have something.
Just my Satchmo moment. Sorry, it's been preserved by Alameda Museum forever. Sorry. The coldest room in my house just became the hottest room in my house. Jeez.
All good. It's climate change. So I'm
yeah,
curious,
I'm blaming it on that too.
I'm curious, just what role might memoir play, considering that there are these archives that are often lost to history as people move or displaced, pass away.
Mm-hmm. Well, memoir, I mean, it could be a cache of letters. It could be a published book. It could be, at this point, video. It doesn't have to be written at all. It could just be, somebody on YouTube or Vimeo or whatever, TikTok, talking about their lives and their impression of their lives. And that is as valid a historic document as anything. Um, Personal essays are memoirs. They're just in short form. I don't know if I'm answering your question right now, but tell me if I'm veering too far off the mark. Um, ask me that question again. I feel like I veered somewhere.
No, I think
I've
it's
skidded off the road.
slightly, but we'll get back on track. I think part of it is thinking about, well, what is an archive? And so I'm going to shift and ask a different question, actually. I'm
Okay.
curious, what's similar and what's different from an archive, as you might think of it as a librarian, versus a memoir as potentially this repository of memory?
Well, an archive is something that has multiple things in it. It could be, many different formats in an archive. It could be, an archive of certainly a single thing like newspapers or something like that. But a memoir is kind of like a document or a group of pieces that form a document, like a cache of correspondences, a collection of letters, a collection of exchange of letters could be considered a memoir. I mean, all of that could be part of an archive. Those letters themselves could be considered an archive. I have a book in my collection, um, a collection of letters between the poet Langston Hughes and his dear friend Arna Bontemps, who was both a librarian and a writer and a collector of African American literature back during the 20s, 30s, and on. Um, so you can look at a memoir as a single document, as opposed to an archive would have multiple things like that in it. Yeah. But I kind of like the metaphoric idea of um, a memoir being an archive of one's life. I like that. You've hit upon something. I like it.
Thank you. The sports people call that an alley-oop. So I wanted to give an opportunity for anyone else to ask a question. And again, we also have Vernon asked a question earlier, which I can bring back up. And then we'll close out our program for the evening.
This has been so fun.
Go for it, Vernon.
Yes, she answered my second question, which was how do people deal with filling in those blanks about memory? That's great. The next question was really, it's when you're trying to sift through your own life, you're looking through the lens out at the world, choosing what's significant and that other people might get really a good knowledge from is sometimes a little difficult. And I guess it's, for me, I would say it's a horn of plenty. What do you keep out and what do you keep in? But I guess maybe Dorothy answered the question. She said it depends on your theme. She said it depends on who your audience is, your primary audience that you want to
Reach.
So, I mean, I think maybe those two things together go hand in hand in helping you select out what's important for others.
Mm-hmm. And then there's no reason to think that you can't write a second memoir about something else.
I like that idea. I don't have
See
to
there, like being a Black professor in New Zealand, for Christ's sakes. I mean, that's a memoir. That's a book right there.
Or the fact that I've got to run right now because I'm still preparing for my 13th Burning Man episode. So
Stop it. Go. Bye.
I have to go.
Leave
But
meeting.
thank you, Dorothy. I love you. Take care.
Love you too, Vernon. Bye.
Thank you for your questions and for joining us.
Yeah,
And that's a great reminder. Frederick Douglass published multiple autobiographies, and so why might folks not be able to publish different memoirs on different areas of their lives?
Sure. Why not? I mean, he published that first narrative as a newly self-emancipated person, and he also published once he became this famous orator. and that was a very different kind of narrative and narrator because he had changed so much and learned so much and traveled so widely.
Absolutely.
But I do want to say before we end that everybody has a story to tell. And I encourage all of you who are on this call to, if you are so inclined, to write that story. Just start writing. You don't have to think about what publisher or anything like that. Just start writing. Write a scene, write another scene, write another scene, and just, fill up a notebook, fill up 10 notebooks. And somewhere you'll find the spine of the story. What's the connective tissue? And you'll have something there.
Well, you certainly have something amazing, and
Thank
we're
you.
really grateful for it. Again, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Alameda Museum for kicking off our 2023 speaker series and sharing a
you.
little bit of your memoir. And I'm going to bring that up on screen in a moment. But please, y'all are welcome to add it to the chat, or for those who are later watching this on YouTube in a classroom or at the library with the headphones on, give it up for Dorothy Lazard.
Thank you all.
Thank you. So I want to just share these brief slides wrapping up. So again, placing yourself in history, the challenges of writing memoir, and Dorothy Lazard sharing. This is our first for the 2023 series. And we have a few more events which will be coming up on the third Mondays of each month for most of the rest of the year. And so next month on September 18th, we'll have Dr. Martina Ayala, who is currently the executive director of the Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts. And she'll be giving a presentation, Chicana Latina Art Histories in the Bay Area. And that'll be a part of Latino Heritage Month. Then we'll have Dr. Claire and Leanne, who started a group, the Alameda Filipino X group, or Deeply Rooted, and they'll be celebrating the Filipinx migration struggles and contributions in Alameda. That'll be on October 16th. And then we'll be ending up this year's series with Charlene Nijme, who is the chairwoman of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe. And that presentation, Muwekma Ohlone Tribe Preservation, Recognition, and Sovereignty, will be taking place on November 20th. And so you're all welcome to join those events, again, on the third Mondays of each month. And we'll have that information on the Alameda Museum website. And if you haven't already read it, but you want to now, you can get the book, What You Don't Know Will Make a Whole New World, the memoir by Dorothy Lazard. It's available via Heyday Books. You can also check out Dorothy's website, DorothyLazard.com. And she's also on the gram or Instagram, and you can follow her at Dorothy Lazard _author. And I'll put a few of those links in the chat now. We'll also have that in the description for YouTube. And then two last points. One, just want to encourage folks, if you're not already, to join the Alameda Museum. And you can find out more information about the organization at alamedamuseum.org. And in the conversations about memoir and thinking about archives, I would be remiss if I did not give this quick, brief, and somewhat somber closing to a young brother I grew up with here in West Alameda, Mike Jones, who passed away, who's actually killed on Sunday morning. And he is listed as this 38-year-old from Pittsburgh in the initial news articles, but he actually grew up in West Alameda. His mom, Terry, amazing barber, used to have the shop at 5th Street in Central, and that's how many of us also had to respect Mike, but he was just such a kind, beautiful young man with a beautiful smile and had been involved in real estate. And so I just want to end with a shout out to Mike Jones. We used to say, who? Mike Jones, because another famous Mike Jones had that little line. But just want to end in the memory of the beautiful Mike Jones from West Alameda. And thank you all.
Rest in peace, Mike. Rest in power, Mike.
RIP. Thank you all for being present, and peace be with you.
Thank you all.